Chapter 4. An Expired Spell. The man that stood above Adin wore a long blue robe that stopped just above his kneecap. Around his chest was a plate of silver armor. There was a symbol of an eye on either side of a triangle and a half circle at the base of the triangles, with 5 solid lines below, between the triangles. A dark leather scabbard hung from one hip, the other hip a quiver full of arrows, all held by a dark leather belt around his waist. A long bow was slung over his shoulder. He wore well-worn leather boots. Adin stared up at the tip of a short sword. The blade, held downward, was held by a tall man. Swarming around him were symbols that glowed around him. They seemed to flutter like glowing moths in the lunar light. "Don't move," said the man, sword blade moving nearer. Adin tried pushing up. He was kicked back down, sword now pressed onto his throat. "Don't test me, boy. I said don't move." Adin gulped, looked from the sword to the man that held it. He tried to say something, but produced no sound. "Are you alone?" asked the man, scanning the area. Yes," he fought to answer the question. "It's just me." "If you came from the Standing Stone Beaches, then you are not alone. Any sane person would never enter that stretch of beach alone, that lawless wilderness." The man glanced toward the direction of the beach. I did not enter the Standing Stone Beaches willingly." Adin felt fear, sword tip pressed down on his throat, trying his best to swallow it down. Adin looked up into the man's face lit by twin moonlight, and the dancing lights of the runes surrounding him. The man seemed puzzled by Adin's answer, so Adin went on to explain. "I was in the void. Then I was pushed onto the beach." "Standing Stone Beaches," Adin added at the end, thinking back to the stones upon the beach. "On your feet. Good. Now follow." The man grabbed Adin, yanking him, helping him roughly to his feet. "This must be the Threadwalker's doing," the armored man said. Adin cocked his head back, asked who the Threadwalker was, and he received a rough shove in answer. Adin was led down the riverbank, where there was a natural rocky bridge across the river. Adin was surprised when, being rushed across the river, he did not slip upon the slippery stones, though the water upon the stones reflected the lights of the twin moon above, the light giving Adin a place to aim his footing. The thought did cross his mind to fall into the water to make an escape, that the water would prevent the heavily armored man to give chase. Running would only make it seem that he was guilty, that he was maybe some sort of fugitive. When faced with the thought of being a prisoner or food for the large crustaceans, Adin chose being a prisoner. Once on the opposite side, he was led into the middle of the camp. The conversation between the two at the camp died down when they heard the approaching armored man. "I found someone lurking in the shadows at the edge of our camp." Adin was once more shoved upon the ground. "No doubt spying on us," added the armored man. The older man stood from where he sat. He approached Adin, leaning on his staff for support. The woman stepped forward, standing beside the older man, and asked, "Who is he? Is there anyone else about?" She stood, staff at the ready, for someone to potentially jump out of the shadows. Adin had managed to position himself better to see those that talked. "I'm not sure about his identity just yet. He claimed to have come through the void, most likely through a tear in the fabrics," answered the man, holding the sword point toward Adin. "A tear?" asked the woman. Adin looked up into her face. There were 2 tightly hanging braids next to her cheek, lit by dancing light. "Pretty braids?" Adin asked, recalling the dream he had just had moments before. The woman stepped forward, next to the older man. "It can't be. No one has called me that since." She knelt down, staring into Adin's face. Adin met her gaze firmly. A moment of recognition passed over her face. "Adin?" Pretty Braids softly said, almost whispering. You know my name? Adin asked, surprised, baffled, and confused. What is going on? This all has to be a dream, Adin said aloud, not meaning to speak his mind aloud to the strangers that stood before him. The old man pushed the tip of his staff towards Adin's chest. He whispered, and his staff produced a light that did not blind Adin. The old man leaned over, considering. Adin and the old man's eyes locked. Recognition also passed across the wrinkled face. The concerned face softened. He finally spoke, not to Adin, but to the man who still held his sword tip downward. The staff light went out as the old man began to lean upon it. George, help him to his feet. Adin is no threat to us. George stomped his feet in defiance, kicked up sand toward Adin. How can we be certain that he is who he claims to be? It was the woman, Pretty Braids, who spoke up, who had been lost in thought. At one point, Adin had broke eye contact with the old man, looking about into the dark faces of those that were gathered. The man George had been sneering, and the young woman looked upward, free hand twirling one of her braids, seemingly deep in thought. Trust me, George, he is Adin. I've only been called Pretty Braids by one person. No one else would have gotten away with it. When we first met Adin, he did not know better to embarrass me. He did, though. Any other person would have received a thump upon his head. The blade was reluctantly put away, and the rune moths that fluttered around George disappeared into glowing dust. Adin was helped to his feet. The man George reluctantly apologized to him. Adin scratched his head, feeling confused. Forgive me. Adin paused before continuing, recalling what the young lady had said, afraid of being whacked upon the head. Adin gulped down his fear, stalled, considered the young lady, then continued. Pardon me, Pretty Braids. I do not recall your name. It may sound strange. The only memories I have of you is from a dream. The old man placed both hands upon the staff, leaning upon it, looking as if the staff would give out at the angle he leaned. The spell has expired. The spell? Asked Adin. Had he finally snapped? Had the barriers between the fantasies he was told as a child and reality truly clashed? When would the peels be given out and his reality return? His world of a padded room. The woman chuckled beneath her breath. Please do not call me that. I am Eleanor, apprentice warlock. She pointed at the old man who still leaned upon his staff, deep in thought. This is Queltagar, my mentor. I'm glad to be meeting with you once more. A shame that you don't remember our time together. We did have quite the adventure. This was indeed reality. The sadness he felt would have awoken him from a dream long ago. Sadness was as strong an emotion as that of fear to awaken those within a dream. Adin saw within the light of the campfire and the glow from the end of her staff that had appeared, a glow that cast the area in a low light, a bubble of light. Eleanor, her smile was slightly crooked, as well as her nose. 10 years ago was the last time I saw you. Eleanor stared at Adin with a look of wonder upon her face. We met 10 years ago? Asked Adin, bewildered. That memory was from 10 years in the past. The armored man George, his armor continued to clink as he paced along the perimeter of the camp, fidgeting with his pack, looking out into the dark, then back at Adin. Eleanor, would you mind putting on some tea? Queltagar asked of her, finally breaking his silence, leading Adin to the cart by the crook of his arm. At the back of the cart, which was actually the entrance, pentagon in shape, was a small staircase that led up. A quick glance inside, Adin saw that the cart, it appeared to have more space within than it actually appeared. The pentagon frame from the outside looked smaller. Adin remembered that Queltagar had mentioned a spell of moments before. Then shock began to overtake him once more, remembering that he had found himself within a storybook of a world. Adin sat down upon the back of the caravan, legs hanging over the side, looking at the fire that blazed nearby. There were so many emotions pouring into him that it was hard to keep up with his thoughts. Over the fire was a crude iron tripod. Eleanor poured water from a glass pitcher that was taken from a compartment off the side of the caravan. The water was poured into a clay pot. From a hook that hung just below the top of the tripod, the pot was placed over the fire. Queltagar placed his staff just outside the door of the caravan in a metal rung, leaning it at an angle. Eleanor disappeared inside, reappearing with a tea infuser that she dropped into the water, who then watched George nervously pace at the edge of the camp. Queltagar approached the pot, produced something wrapped in a cloth. Adin watched Queltagar open the piece of cloth. Flower petals floated down into the pot. Adin sat staring into the flames, listening to the burning coals, to the crackle pop, and the pacing at the camp's edge. The tall coastal shrubbery danced in the dark. Wildlife continued to sing, to converse, and the current of the nearby river produced ambient music of its own. Adin heard them, but his mind was numb. On the opposite side of the fire, Queltagar had found a place to rest. Adin saw him take his seat, watching, as the old man studied him from the corner of his eyes, though not really seeing. Eleanor sat next to Adin. She spoke, but what was said to Adin he did not comprehend. It wasn't until Queltagar had poured Adin a glass of tea, shoving it into his hand, did Adin escape from within his own mind. While Adin considered the warm cup of tea, Queltagar called out to George, beckoning him over. "Come, take a seat by the fire, Sir George. Calm yourself with a cup of tea. Worry will eat a hole into your stomach. Cease your worry." George looked out into the darkness, then back toward Adin, Eleanor, and Queltagar. He turned on his heels, mumbling. George, when he reached Queltagar, he took the cup, went to the fire, dropped to one knee. George then considered the tea, looked up at Queltagar. The old man motioned for the younger men to drink. George cursed in a language unfamiliar to Adin. The tone, the sharpness of the words, was not lost to Adin. With a glowing palm open over the tea cup, George materialized one of those fluttering runes. It flew downward into the cup, a small flash of white light. Then it was extinguished. "I am quite capable of calming myself without aid," George said sharply, almost angrily, to Queltagar. Adin still held the teacup, cupped in his hands. He brought the tea to the tip of his nose, breathing it in. The tea smelled of flowers, specifically lavender. The petals that were put in the boiling pot floated at the top of the cup. Adin looked back up to see Queltagar shrug in response to George. Queltagar then poured what remained of the tea into a small glass vial. The vial was then put into a pouch hanging off of one of the compartments to the side of the caravan. Adin did not trust these people, much less did he trust his eyes, unsure if this was actually still reality or a dream. The call of birds, the fluttering of wings, caught Adin's attention. They had been silent within the caravan. Eleanor jumped up from her place beside the fire, fetching the white birds in their metal cage. Then she placed the birds upon the hook of Queltagar's staff. Strangely, Adin could not hear their thoughts. When Adin tried reaching out to them, concentrating, trying to connect with them, there was only silence. Adin finally sipped upon his tea, considering them. The tea was strong, bittersweet, yet calming. The calming that came over Adin rushed over him quickly. The feeling, a sensation similar to being lightheaded. Adin greedily sipped on the tea faster. Well, sipping as much as a hot cup of tea would allow. If not for the tea burning the tip of his tongue, he would have gulped it all down. Adin was sipping his tea, watching Eleanor feed the white birds small seeds, when Queltagar asked, "Tell me, Adin, how is it that you came back to Enola?" Adin brought his attention to Queltagar. "I was with Calder," Adin began. "Calder was my dog," Adin explained. He retold how he dreamed of a storm. When he awoke, there was a storm in the waking world. How Calder had discovered the tear into the void. His father was within the void also. That the stories that he was told as a child was not fiction. That they were actually true. That Enola actually existed. Then there was a shadow that took my father. I lost Calder. Father pushed me through the tear, and then I blacked out. I woke upon standing stone beaches. Adin finished the story, feeling almost relieved. Recalling the purple mist, he looked once more at Eleanor, a familiar face. Adin knew he was not locked away in some mental ward. George dumped the remainder of his tea, stood knocking the dirt from his knees. "If this one could sneak that close to our camp," he motioned to Adin. George returned the empty cup to Queltagar. "I'm sure others could do the same." Queltagar pointed towards the 2 doves in their cage that hung from Queltagar's slanted staff. "That is not necessary. If there is truly danger in the area, Dalene and Teleus would warn us." The doves cooed, as if in answer. George looked around the darkness near the edge of the camp. He placed his hand upon the hilt of his sword. "That may be so. Though I will sleep in peace. Much better if I do at least one pass of the perimeter." He then left them sitting around the campfire. Adin downed the rest of his tea, considering the empty cup. "Just so you know, Adin, George I'm sure doesn't hate you, if that thought crossed your mind. George is usually gruff and doesn't trust anyone. He would eye a newborn suspiciously," Eleanor explained. "The whole Watcher Order, actually," Eleanor added, rolling her eyes. "The Watchers?" asked Adin, looking up from the empty cup. Queltagar stood with George's empty cup in one hand and pointed to Adin's. Adin handed it over as Queltagar said, "There will be plenty time to answer questions tomorrow. You are no doubt weary from your journey." The old man handed the empty cups to Eleanor, who began washing them in a bucket that she filled with water from a barrel on the side of the wagon. "You can sleep within the comfort of my wagon. You will find it warm and safe. It is my home away from home." Adin stood from where he sat, agreeing with Queltagar. He did feel drained from today's ordeal. The tiredness seemed to wash over him from out of left field. He walked from where he sat, almost stumbling with each step. Legs heavy and tired, he climbed up the steps with help from Queltagar. "I'm quite capable of calming myself without aid," George had said. "The tea?" asked Adin, feeling drained. "Yes, the tea," answered Queltagar, stepping up into the carriage with Adin, guiding him to a bed, pulling back the furs, helping him into the bed. "The tea will help you sleep," Queltagar said, as Adin fell into a deep slumber. Adin awoke before all the others. On a round table sat the bird cage. Draped over it was a green cloth, with white stars and white swirling lines. The doves beneath softly cooed. Adin had surprisingly awoke feeling refreshed. Not once did he dream. 4 walls made up the caravan. One was the entrance. The 2 walls that joined with the door had 4 round windows on each side. The frames dark, the actual walls light. Across from the door, with a half wall with a heavy curtain that blended in with the light blue walls and dark blue beams. Off of the frames hung bundles of drying herbs. At the foot of the bed was a mirror hanging on the wall that caught Adin by surprise. He stood at the mirror. His reflection looked haggard, tired, posture slumped over, brunette hair unkempt, his recently fresh-shaved face already growing stubble. His blue-gray eyes were red. He felt like always on the verge of shedding tears now. His blue jeans were sand-covered and shirt wrinkled. Adin stood up straight, breathed in deeply. It did not help with the grief he felt. He turned and slumped once more. Inside were cabinets, bookcases, shelves filled with a variety of herbs. Labels identified the contents of each jar, but Adin did not know how to read them. Enola, it seemed, had their own language, an alphabet of their own. How did he communicate with these people from another world? It was another mystery. Adin stepped out of the caravan. The roof jutted out over the stairs. Outside it was a wet, dew-covered world. Everything looked greener. The air slightly cooler than it had been on the beach. The air that filled his lungs pure, free of impurities. He saw that morning there was much more mist in the air. It swirled about in the air as if it was a being itself. It was a sight to behold, a mist that seemed to dance about with no breeze at all, a purple mist. George still slept in a bedroll, grasping his short sword in his sleep. He had his longbow leaning against a nearby tree within easy reach, in case if he needed to use it in a hurry. Eleanor, she had fallen asleep, holding a book upon her chest, polished wooded staff laying on the ground to her side. Her chest rose and fell, breathing steadily. Queltigar sat before the fire. Its coals had burned down low. He had already packed his things and smoked a pipe. He blew smoke from his nose and nodded at Adin and asked, "Are you feeling well rested?" Adin rubbed the sleep from his eyes, glancing around at his surroundings. The sea, it was still within sight. He could smell it, the salt, and hear waves, the call of gulls far off. The camp was set up on a flat patch of grass, on a grass-covered incline that sloped down toward the river. On the other side of the incline there was a sand-covered slope path that led down to the river crossing. Tied to a tree in a solitary stand of trees, nearby was a pony that grazed in the grass. Its tail whipped back and forth. It was content, voice silent. Past that was tall golden grass, a sea of grass. Crickets chirped, and then there was the mountain in the distance. "The tea?" Adin inquired. He was curious, recalling George's reaction to the tea. Adin did not want to accuse, especially if the tea was meant to help. If not, well, maybe he would be joining Christopher and Calder shortly. "Ah, yes, Vandula folia. The plant has a natural magical property of calming," explained Queltigar. "Also makes for a great bedtime tea. Calms the mind. Well, honestly numbs the mind. I have more if you need it." Queltigar passed over an object wrapped in a piece of paper. Adin eyed it suspiciously. "Scone," he explained. "Nothing to worry about. I don't plan to poison you. You don't remember of yet, like Eleanor. We have met in your previous sojourn. I am your ally, truthfully." Adin took the pastry, thanking Queltigar, yet still feeling suspicious toward them. Eleanor wrote before George, pulling herself up into a sitting position, as Adin took a bite of the scone. She watched him as he chewed upon the pastry. "How was the scone?" Eleanor asked. Adin stopped mid-chew, having taken a large bite, feeling famished, no memory if he had even eaten the previous day. Adin nodded, mumbled, through a mouthful of scone. "Buttery. It tastes fresh." The scone had recently been baked. "My mother is a baking witch." She closed her book, placing it in a bulging satchel next to her bedroll. Eleanor crawled to the edge of her bedroll, going through the process of rolling it tightly. "My mother's aptitude in casting spells is something to behold. but to watch in the kitchen is mesmerizing. Watching the coals and what remained of a smoking log, never looking up, Queltigar breathed out smoke from his nose, coughed lightly, the cough of a smoker. Ellis is undeniably an adept bakester. Eleanor slung her satchel over her shoulder, picked up her bedroll, then peered puzzled at the old man, eyebrows raised. In the morning light, Adin, he saw that Eleanor's robe was blue, sleeveless, a black leather belt around her waist. It was modest, revealing only the skin of her arms, pale arms, except for areas where her skin was turning pink from being out in the sun. Her pants were dark, tucked into worn brown thigh-high boots. Her face was round, her chin small, but well pronounced. Her eyes were brown, eyelids dark, and she was slightly covered in freckles, her cheeks also turning a shade of pink. Her brows looked well looked after, yet full. She wasn't skinny, nor was she overweight. Her breast and waist complemented her frame. It was the kind of thing that a young man couldn't help but notice, as hard as they try not to notice. "She baked these?" Adin asked, having swallowed his mouthful, looking at the buttery flakes and lightly brown crust. "Those are her doing, Adin. We were returning from visiting her yesterday. It was lucky of you to have appeared when you did. Mother's scones were still fresh." "It was convenient timing," said George, standing up from his bedroll. "Convenient that Adin appeared from a tear so very near." The watcher eyed the three of them, wary. "George," Queltigar said, dumping the ash from his pipe, standing, rubbing the lower section of his back. Queltigar wore a light, warm brown traveling cloak. A twin white feathered pin secured the cloak around his neck. Beneath the cloak was a gray doublet, with a design like white scales upon it. Leather boots in fair condition, though caked on with mule manure. His face worn, with green, kind eyes, clean-shaved, brows bushy, quickly turning gray, hair thick, though gray at the temples. "We must set off at once, with haste." Eleanor and Queltigar paid no attention to the watcher's distrust, waved off the man's distrust. Adin doubted that there was any other reason for the three of them being near. Pure coincidence. Adin finished his pastry, attempted to help in tearing down the camp. The three of them dismissed Adin's offer of help, insisting that he rest. Resting gave Adin time to dwell on all that had transpired the previous day. It was a train of thought that he wanted to avoid. To distract himself, he walked back toward the river where he had crossed, staring across at the standing stone beaches, where stones dotted the rocky beach. To avoid thinking, Adin focused on a group of seagulls in the distance, watching them soar above the sea, diving down closer to the shore in search of food. Behind him he heard the bump, clatter, and curses of George, putting things away. Adin looked down at his fist, the one he had slammed into the veined rock. It had healed completely. The preparations to the camp were slowing down. George walked the mule over to the carriage, saddled, and attached the mule to the front of the caravan with the appropriate equipment. Eleanor joined Adin next to the river. She looked out across the standing stone beaches as a tall wave crashed, momentarily submerging the beach. When the waters were pulled back into the ocean, the stones lodged in the ground remained. "I'm glad I came to the standing stone beaches," Eleanor said, spiritless, almost as if she did not mean it. Adin turned to her, about to call her out. He stopped, noticing that she looked as haggard as his reflection had been. It was a broken-hearted look. Eleanor's demeanor changed quickly. She smiled gaily. She no longer looked like a stone in the night of winter. Adin felt like that stone's warmth returned. "I am truly glad that you returned, Adin," Her smile warmed him. Adin walked back to the caravan with Eleanor in silence. She disappeared to the back. Jord stood upon the steps, watching Adin walk out of sight to the front of the caravan. Queltagar sat in the coachman's seat of the caravan. Adin pulled himself up next to the warlock. "We are off to Telegem," Queltagar told Adin, working the reins, calling out for the mule to pull off. The caravan lurched forward, following a path that it had cut through the tall grass when it had passed through previously. The floating city in the sky, the grandest kingdom in Enola, Telegem. "What is our purpose in Telegem?" Adin asked. Curiousness and excitement were starting to grow. Enola was real. Telegem was real. A world that he thought was to be a fantasy. "The High King no doubt will hold court with you and summon the ruling conclave." Queltagar coughed, then cleared his throat. "The High King?" exclaimed Adin, the feeling of excitement being crushed. Wide-eyed with anxiety, "What business do I have with a king? A High King at that?" "You crossed over through the void from Earth," Queltagar said, looking off the path toward Adin. "Don't worry yourself over this. Your memory will return in time. With your returning memory, answers to questions you no doubt have." The caravan eventually left behind the coastal plain. It pulled out of a stand of trees onto a well-worn road. Dirt, animal tracks, and animal leavings were on the sometimes cobbled stone road. Every so often the wagon passed rock walls where jewels gleamed in the sunlight. Queltagar explained to Adin that they traveled a length of road called the Tradeway. The Tradeways connected all of the Enola ruling kingdoms, giving each of the kingdoms direct overland access to Telegem. When pointing out the jewels, he explained the jewels were a beacon, a signal to those that traveled upon the Tradeway that the road is safe to traverse. The High Kings, keepers of peace, patrol the ways, lighting the jewels as they pass, Queltagar said, pulling the carriage to a stop. To trade places with Jorge. When Jorge took the reins, he added, "When these jewels are unlit, keepers of peace have not yet passed, or maybe even not passed at all." Fear began to rise in Adin's stomach. Every tree the caravan passed, Adin's imagination put a highwayman behind it. Every ditch he expected a black tentacle to appear. Adin had remained quiet, watching for foes and deep in thought. Midday came, the sun high above, when they stopped on the side of the tradeway. The traveler stretched her legs, let the mule rest, had a midday meal, and urinated. They did not stop for long, shortly returning on the bumpy road. Adin, he had always been more observant, more than he was talkative. When socializing, Adin would spend most of his time listening, nodding his head. He was rarely the person to engage in conversation. In those cases that he had been the one to instigate, he was to point out important facts or details. Mostly it was to ask a question. "Queltagar, do you mind if I ask you a question?" Adin asked, when the warlock returned to the coachman's seat after their small break. Adin watched the ever-looming mountain range in the distance. The mountain had grew closer and closer. Recalling his dream of standing upon the cliffs of a mountain range, hand in hand with Christopher, looking at a floating city, the grand hub city, Telegem. Queltagar pulled lightly back on the reins. The horse slowed down its pace. The sorcerer raised his thick eyebrows upward. "Depends on the question," answered Queltagar. Adin glanced at the hooked staff sitting between him and Queltagar. It had glowed with a light last night. Eleanor had produced a bubble over their camp, casting the area in a low light. It reminded Adin of the sword from Lord of the Rings. It glowed when goblins were nearby. Magic. Enchantments. All sorts of impossible feats were possible in Enola, if the stories Christopher told him were true. Adin rushed forward. "You mentioned that the spell had weakened when you learned of my passing through the void last night." Ah, yes. I figured that question would be asked sooner or later. I'm actually surprised that it was later. To be honest, I've been dwelling on it ever since you made the statement. I didn't know when would be best to ask. Do you remember your first coming to Enola? Queltegar asked Adin, both thick eyebrows slightly raised. No, though it seemed that I have dreamed of it. That is how I remembered calling Eleanor. Adin looked toward the back of the caravan. Eleanor was no doubt listening to their conversation. He did not know for sure, but in a world of magic where you could be possibly magically thumped upon the head, Adin did not continue. Queltegar noticed the pause, then chuckled. There are other memories as well, Adin recalled the dream he had before, stepping through the tear back at home. The old man stared down at the reins, fists curled tight, thumbs digging into the leather. Queltegar breathed in deeply. Adin, startled at the sight of the purple mist, as it disappeared into the old man's nostrils. Adin's jaws were slightly lowered, mouth agape. As you know, those are your memories of your first sojourn to Enola. Queltegar paused. Adin thought that the sorcerer would not continue. He did, after a long pause. I have to be careful of what memories I share with you concerning your time in Enola. A person's brain can be fragile, and false memories can be devastating, like a lie you tell yourself so often that you actually believe it, that you are not able to tell truth from lie. A long pause once more. This is a question I can answer, the answer having a direct connection to your returning memories. Before you returned to Earth, a group of sorcerers, including me, weaved a spell over your mind to block all memories of your coming to Enola. Queltegar looked forward, his face empty of any sort of emotion. You blocked my memory? Why would you do that to me? Adin asked. Weakly. So much was happening. He was feeling mentally and physically exhausted once more. We thought it best. You would never have lived a normal life upon Earth if you had memories of Enola. You would have tried coming back, no doubt obsessed over this world. It would never have been normal knowing what you have learned. Queltegar's face remained emotionless, breathing in more of the purple mist. Adin felt his face become flushed, stomach sick, tears growing. You could have not known that, he began to say. They could not have known what his life would have been like. Christopher and Calder may still have been alive if he had stayed in Enola in the first place. Why couldn't have Christopher, Calder, and he had lived in Enola from the beginning? Queltegar finally broke his stern look, replaced with a look of empathy. I'm sorry, Adin. As I said, it would have been too dangerous for you to have memories of Enola. Those that know of existence beyond their world have tendencies to grasp for that world, to search out for that world in dangerous ways. They become a danger to oneself as well as others. Adin withdrew into himself even more for the remainder of that day. As evening approached, the sun quickly started to lower. The flat tradeway started to become more inclined and rocky. It wasn't until they came to a forested edge, the tradeway had disappeared into the forest, that Queltegar brought the carriage to a halt. We make camp here for the night. At daybreak, we will continue our journey. Adin jumped down from his seat, considering one of the rock walls with a lit jewel, the first lit jewel he had seen on the stretch of the tradeway all day. Adin felt a mixture of emotions, so he hurried toward the forest edge. The trees resembled that of birch, though they were much larger, with bark curling off its trunk. The brush at the forest edge was thick with green life. Eleanor appeared from out of the back of the carriage. She rubbed her eyes, a book held over her chest, as Adin walked by her. She watched as Adin approached the forest edge. It may be dangerous in the forest, she called out to Adin. Queltegar with staff and birdcage on the tip of the staff stepped next to Eleanor. Leave him be, Eleanor. He needs to be with himself and his thoughts. He opened the bird cage. Deline and Telius flew from the cage into the forest.